Hi there, listener. Welcome in. This is Strange Stories from Odd Folks. That's folks with an X. This episode's story is titled Hungry House, a scary ghostly tale by Lee Hulme. Content warnings for this episode are ghostly happenings, swearing, potential triggers for body dysmorphia. Please remember to take good care of yourself. And with that, why don't we begin?
Ah, crap, sighs the stocky young man with wavy brown hair. All right, I'll go. Who's with me? The older man with rapidly thinning white hair and thick brown glasses shakes his head. Sorry, kid, just you. Got no one to spare for this one. The kid, actually in his late 20s, nods and turns around to grab his coat off the back of his chair. Oh, and Mason, the white-haired man says. Mason looks back, one hand on his coat. Yeah, Chief? Be careful, son. I don't like sending my guys out there on their own with nothing but a hunch and a tip-off to go on. Mason smiles. I will, thanks, Chief. Mason puts on his coat, checks his gun holster, and leaves the office. A moment later, he dashes back in, grabs his car keys from the top left corner of his desk, and strolls back out again with a gait that is slightly more sheepish than his usual half-swagger. He climbs into his car, an old Vauxhall Cavalier with so many original parts and pieces lovingly replaced that it is more like a new Vauxhall Cavalier, and in decidedly better condition than its owner, he decides, as he pulls his coat closer around him and shivers in the cold air, waiting for the heater to do its job. As he waits, his mind skips ahead of him towards the house he is to go and investigate. The house on the hill. Not a normal hill, no. This house has a hill of its very own. The pavement turns into what looks like a side road, but is actually a cobbled driveway, which leads up the hill to a stone wall with iron gates, beyond which a path, closed in by grass and flower beds, leads further up the hill to the house itself. Mason had only been further than that once, before today. Just once. And he never, ever wanted to go there again. But coming back to himself now the car is a little warmer, he reminds himself that was then, and this is now. Then he was a scared teenager. Now he is, supposedly, a fully grown, fearless officer of the law. And he has a job to do. So he starts the engine, pulls out of his space, and drives off, trying hard not to remember the last time he was in that house, but going back there anyway. The house had once been a mansion belonging to some rich, important person of the town. That's what it had been built for, anyhow, sometime in the 1800s. But that owner, it was said, disappeared in some mysterious and unspecified circumstances. And so did every owner after that until, for the last century or so, it had been left empty. And yet it had never fallen into disrepair. The building, the grounds, never so much as a speck of dirt or a weed was ever to be seen. Of course, everyone around who knew the house thought it was haunted, even if they wouldn't admit it. Mostly it was only the kids who talked about it. And of course, once they talked about it, they had to start daring each other to go up there. And Mason, trying to impress a pretty girl at the time, of course had to go one step further and try the door. And once the door swung open, of course he had to step inside. He had gotten in as far as the corridor leading from the foyer to whatever room was beyond. That was as far as he had dared to go. He had stood still, listening for any sounds through the rest of the house. As he had been about to give in, he had heard the creak of a stair and a hoarse, dry cough. In a flash, he had turned and fled, leaving the door and the gate hanging open behind him. He met his friends, laughing but impressed, at the other side of the street from the bottom of the hill. And they had gone, spent the rest of the day in idle pursuit, and Mason had all but forgotten about his trip inside the house, was beginning already to push the creak and the cough to the back of his mind and dismiss it as imaginary. But his route home that evening had taken him back past the house, and, stopping at the foot of the hill to look up at it, he saw that both the door and the gate were now closed. From that day to this, he had not been able to convince himself that it was simply some considerate, living person who had done that. From that day to this, he had gone out of his way to avoid even walking past it on the other side of the road. Even now, with only a faint memory of the actual event, the terror that he has held onto for so long is rising back to the surface as he pulls into the bottom part of the driveway, allowing the rear of the car to face the road, as he knows without question that his driving skill is not good enough to pull in and back up that steep a hill without incident. He radios that he has arrived and slips the unit into a pocket for safekeeping. He walks to the gate and tries it. It opens without a sound, and he thinks, fleetingly, that he would have been happier if it had squealed and made him jump. It would have told him that nobody had done maintenance here for a while. Beyond the high wall, the noise of the main road is dulled to a faint rumble. Mason's shoes sound loud in the unnatural silence as he walks as quietly as he can up the path to the front door, painfully aware that every window in the house is watching him approach. His hand slips unconsciously to the holster on his belt and unclips it, touching the butt of the gun gently, as if to be reassured of its solidity. He studies the house as he approaches. It is exactly as he remembers it. Not a weed, not a scrap of dirt, perfectly clean and preserved, as if a whole team is working on it, day and night. And yet it is so still. It is a ghost house. And Mason wants to turn and flee back to his car, possibly gibbering, and sit in the driver's seat and rock backwards and forwards until he stops shaking enough to pull out and drive back to the police station as fast as possible and damn anyone who laughs at him for being afraid because they weren't here and they don't know. He catches himself with a mental kick, calming his breathing, feeling his heartbeat slip down from the red zone, and stops at the door. "Calm down, man," he murmurs, comforted to know that at least his own voice comes out sounding real and alive. "This scared before you even get in? Get over it. You were a kid. Time to grow up. Something crime-like's going on in there. Might have been the source of all the problem for all you know. So you walk in, you ignore anything they throw at you, scary or violent or what all, and you find out what the hell is wrong with this place. All right? All right." He nods to himself reassuringly and turns the handle on the front door, pulling his gun out of its holster and switching on the powerful torch attached to it. The door is, as expected, unlocked. But before he can fling it open and enter the premises, yelling in his best tough cop voice, he remembers that he is alone, and therefore vulnerable. Instead, he swings the door open quietly and flashes the torch around the empty corridor. Before he steps inside, he flips on the light and is somehow unsurprised to see it blossom without a flicker, flooding the hallway corridor. Mason takes a few steps in and pauses, just as he has done when he was a young boy, listening for anything, both expecting and fearing to hear that same creak of a stair, that same hoarse, dry cough. He stands there for seconds that feels like days, and he hears nothing. There is only one door in the corridor, and he opens it the same way as the front door, swinging it open gently so as not to draw unwarranted attention to himself, or come across as the aggressor, a sure way for a solo cop of any rank to get himself killed. There is nothing in the room, not even old furniture. The paint is chipped, the wooden floor is cracked and warped, and the whole thing looks lost, somehow. Mournful. Mason turns away and closes the door behind him, moving carefully to the end of the corridor and pausing at the point where the hallway ends and the very large living room/dining room explodes out of it. It is also neglected and empty, devoid of either furniture or life. But as Mason turns his head to flick the light switch, he sees movement from the corner of his eye. His well-trained gun hand comes up to train on the movement even before his head has moved back to look at it. But as his eyes focus, Mason takes an involuntary step back. Hanging from a light fitting that a moment ago wasn't there, in a nightgown patterned with pink flowers, is an old woman with straw-like gray and white hair down to her shoulders and one fluffy pink slipper hanging loosely on one foot. She sways slightly, as if pushed by an unfelt breeze, and her face is swollen and puffy. As Mason looks, he realizes that he can see the far wall through her, and as that realization sinks in, the woman's head snaps upwards and her eyes fix Mason with a malevolent glare. He screams and fires once, twice, 3 times at the transparent body before realizing it has vanished and forcing his finger off the trigger. Turning on the light, he looks again around the room, but the only odd thing he can see is 3 brand new bullet holes in the opposite wall. The room is big and empty. No hanging woman on a non-existent light fitting. The only points of interest are a staircase across the room and on the right, and another door halfway up the left wall. Moving as silently as the sadly neglected mahogany floor will allow, Mason walks first to the door, which he swings open with a little less care than before, knowing that anyone within earshot of his gunshots already knows he is here. The room is a kitchen. Spacious, fancy, meticulously clean, suspiciously empty, with a door in the far wall leading, Mason presumes from the look of the sturdy metal and frosted glass, outside, and a door in the right wall that he walks swiftly over to. It opens outwards and reveals a long, narrow pantry. The shelves are empty of food, and they are as clean as everywhere else. There is another door at the far end, and he walks to that next. This one, too, opens outwards and reveals a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. Mason lifts his gun and shines the lights onto the walls, looking for a light switch, and, finding a double set, turns them both on. The steps are illuminated, and he walks down them to a carved stone room with what looks like a bar at one end, though its shelves are as empty as the pantry. He explores the corners, but, finding nothing, turns back to the stairs. His foot on the first step, his back turned to the room, looking back up to the top of the stairs, Mason hears a low growl from behind him. Feels a warm puff of air, just like a snort from the nostrils of some beast, on the back of his neck, and he spins around, losing his balance and falling to the floor. His gun clatters away, and he hears the tinkle as the torch smashes. But the room is still empty. Yet as he sits up and begins to crawl towards his gun, he hears a somehow familiar clicking sound. He stops dead, and the sound continues. Another soft growl comes from the direction of the stairs, and Mason places the clicks. It is the sound of overlong claws tapping on the ground with each step of the large, dark paw of some invisible monster. Mason grabs his gun and swings around, aiming wildly but seeing nothing. Only his ears tell him that something is there. His ears, and the prickling on the nape of his neck where he felt the thing's hot breath. A third low growl brings Mason clambering to his feet and taking the stairs 2 at a time, slamming first the cellar door and then the pantry door behind him and backing up until the small of his back hits a kitchen counter, stopping him in his tracks, straining his ears for any hint of the thing escaping and coming to find him. But he hears nothing, and relaxing, turns around and leans on the counter, facing the window, and looks up, only to shout and leap backwards again as he sees a bright white, somehow grotesque, grinning face pressed up against the glass and staring back at him. He closes his eyes tightly and counts to 10 before opening them, and when he does, the window is dark again. Mason exits the kitchen in a hurry, closing the door firmly behind him even before he turns to check out the living room. It is still empty, so he walks across it and climbs the stairs steadily, gun at the ready. Each step creaks slightly underfoot, and he is forced to remember his childhood again and resist a disturbing urge to imitate the cough he heard all those years ago. He reaches the top of the stairs and, back to the one solid wall, he scans the landing as well as he can through the dim light coming from the room below, counting 4 doors but seeing nothing else. He reaches his hand out to the wall, feeling for a light switch, expecting at any moment to feel another hand close over his. But he finds the switch and lights the landing without event. He approaches the first door and hears tinkling laughter coming from inside. The laughter of a child. He opens the door carefully, keeping his gun handy but concealed from the child within, so as not to scare him or her, and looks around. But there is no living thing in the room. There is only a fallen pile of colored bricks. Mason backs out, closes the door, and opens the one right next to it. It is a small bathroom, child-sized, he thinks. He steps inside to pull back the shower curtain and yells out again as he hears a sudden loud sobbing from behind it, the sound of a child in distress. "It's okay. I'm here to help. I won't hurt you, I promise," Mason says as softly and reassuringly as he can, while he puts his gun into his holster and edges forward slowly, reaching for the shower curtain. The sobbing cuts off abruptly as Mason pulls the curtain back to reveal a glisteningly clean but completely empty bath. He steps back and sighs. "I'm getting real tired of this crap," he says aloud, and walks back out. The next door is at the far end of the landing, and Mason sets out towards it, but stops abruptly, listening. He has heard footsteps, in sync with his own, but heavier, booted. The sound stops when he does, and he takes another 2 steps, then stops again. The sound is definitely there. He takes another step, then hops, then does a few irregular stomps, and each time the sound of his own shoe is covered by the sound of a heavier, booted tread. A crazy thought hits him, and he looks down at his own feet. His carefully polished shoes are gone, replaced by scuffed boots. "What?" he begins, but looks up as he hears more sobbing. Adult sobbing this time. A woman, and it comes from the next door down. Mason grits his teeth, narrows his eyes, and, sick of playing games, he kicks open the door and slides inside, his gun at the ready. But the only thing in the room is a bed with rumpled sheets and a fading dent that might be the shape of a body that had lain there only moments ago. Mason stomps out of the room, still hearing, still seeing, the heavy boots on his feet. He faces the final door and snarls at it as he lifts one of those heavy boots and kicks it open with a crash. A quick look tells him there is nothing in this room either. It's just a half bathroom with a toilet and sink. Mason leans on the basin in front of the mirror, his head down warily. He sighs to himself and looks up into the mirror. But instead of seeing his own face, its familiar lines, the wavy hair, the slight upturn of his mouth, and the cleft in his strong chin, he sees another face entirely. This face is red, but not withered. It It is smooth and round. Its nose is squashed, and its eyes are small and dark. Mason staggers back from the mirror, his hands raised, but even they are no longer his hands. They are plump and pale, the palms smooth, and the arms attached to them are no longer covered in a gray coat, but a black jacket, accompanied by black trousers. The man in the bathroom looks around wildly, trying to see where Mason has gone to, but he is the only one there. And slowly he turns around and walks with a heavy, ponderous tread to the bedroom, where an unhappy-looking woman with a sharp, angular body and a stern face, half hidden by a purpling bruise, watches him fearfully. "Albert, no," she whispers, as Albert balls his fist again and steps closer. And Mason is nowhere to be seen. And the house, sated again, for now, creaks slightly as it shifts into a more comfortable position where it can slumber again for a while, until the next time somebody comes to wake it up.
Thank you so much for listening. That was Hungry House, read by Tracy Clifton and written and edited by Lee Hulme. If you are LGBTQIA2S+, and you'd like to submit a story for use, well, we'd love to hear from you. Check the show notes for a link to do that. Also in the show notes, find info on the music, sound effects, and where else you can find us. We love visitors, so do come and say hi. This show is produced by Tracy Clifton, Lexi Jones, and Lee Hulme. Intro and outro read by America Young. This has been a Team Cuddles production.